The coffee cup shattered against the pavement as Emma Rodriguez hit the ground hard. Blood trickled from her split lip as she watched Chad Williams grind his heel into the small velvet box containing her father's Purple Heart. The medal, the last piece of Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez she had left, lay twisted and scratched in the dirt. What these college bullies didn't know was that the quiet barista they'd been tormenting for months had spent 2 tours in Afghanistan and possessed combat training that could end their weekend plans permanently. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Mountain View Café as Emma Rodriguez tied her apron and began her Saturday shift. The small coffee shop sat just 2 blocks from Riverside Community College, making it a popular hangout for students who preferred overpriced lattes to dining hall coffee. Emma moved with quiet efficiency behind the counter, her movements precise and economical in a way that spoke of military training, though none of the regular customers ever noticed. To them, she was just another 22-year-old working her way through life, probably struggling to make rent like half the other service workers in this college town. The truth was far more complex. Emma Rodriguez was a former United States Marine who had served 2 tours overseas before receiving an honorable discharge following her father's death. She'd traded desert camouflage for a green apron, automatic weapons for espresso machines, but the skills she'd learned in the Corps remained sharp beneath her civilian exterior. The small apartment she rented on Oak Street was modest, but she could afford it comfortably thanks to her GI Bill benefits and the steady income from the cafe. More importantly, the job gave her something she desperately needed, a sense of purpose during a time when everything else in her life felt uncertain. Emma's father, Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, had been everything to her. A career military man who'd enlisted right out of high school, he'd raised Emma as a single parent after her mother died when Emma was 12. He'd taught her discipline, respect, and the meaning of service before country. When Emma decided to follow in his footsteps and enlist in the Marines, Carlos had been the proudest man in California. He'd been there when she graduated from boot camp, when she earned her military police designation, and when she deployed for her first tour. What he hadn't been there for was her return from her second deployment, because an IED in Helmand Province had claimed his life 3 months before she came home. The Purple Heart had arrived in the mail 6 weeks later, along with a letter from his commanding officer explaining that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been wounded while providing medical aid to Afghan civilians caught in the blast. He died trying to save others, which Emma supposed was exactly how her father would have wanted to go. She wore the medal on a thin chain around her neck, usually tucked beneath her shirt, close to her heart. It was the only piece of him she had left, and touching it helped her remember his voice during the hardest moments. Working at Mountain View Café wasn't Emma's long-term plan. She was using her veterans' benefits to take classes at the community college, working toward a degree in criminal justice with dreams of joining the police force, or perhaps the FBI. But the transition from military to civilian life had been harder than she'd expected. The structure, the clear chain of command, the sense of mission, all of that was gone, replaced by the chaos of college life and the monotony of serving coffee to entitled students who complained if their foam art wasn't perfect. Most customers treated her politely enough, if somewhat dismissively. She was part of the background of their college experience, as invisible as the chairs and tables. A few regulars knew her name and asked about her classes, but for the most part, Emma existed on the periphery of their world. She preferred it that way. Attention had never been something she sought, and the anonymity of her current life felt safe after years of hypervigilance in war zones. But not everyone at Mountain View Café was content to let Emma blend into the background. Chad Williams had been coming to the shop since the beginning of the semester, and from the start, he'd seemed to take particular pleasure in making her life difficult. Chad was everything Emma had learned to despise during her time in the service: entitled, arrogant, and utterly convinced that his family's money made him untouchable. At 19, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across Southern California, and Chad made sure everyone knew it. He drove a BMW that cost more than most people made in a year and wore designer clothes that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent. Chad rarely came to the cafe alone. His usual companions were Kyle Bennett, a pre-law student whose father was a prominent attorney in Los Angeles, and Mason Davis, a freshman whose wealthy family had bought their way into local social circles. The three of them formed a toxic trinity of privilege and cruelty, targeting anyone they perceived as beneath their social status. Emma had watched them humiliate other workers, mock students who couldn't afford the latest fashion trends, and generally behave like the worst stereotypes of spoiled rich kids. She'd also noticed that they seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting her. It had started small. Chad would order complicated drinks and then complain loudly that Emma had made them wrong, demanding remakes that were clearly unnecessary. He'd leave messes on his table and make snide comments about the service when she came to clean up. Kyle would film these interactions on his phone, apparently finding it hilarious to document what he called coffee shop employee meltdowns, though Emma never gave him the satisfaction of losing her composure. Mason, meanwhile, seemed content to laugh along with whatever cruelty his friends devised, desperate for their approval and too weak to stand up for what was right. The harassment had escalated over the weeks. Chad had started making comments about Emma's background, asking loudly if she was one of those community college kids who couldn't get into a real university. He'd speculated about her financial situation, wondering aloud if she lived in some dumpy apartment with 6 roommates. Kyle had begun taking photos of her without permission, claiming he was documenting typical service worker behavior for some imaginary sociology project. The three of them would occupy the outdoor seating area for hours, ordering single drinks and making increasingly personal and cruel observations about Emma and other workers. Emma's military training had taught her discipline and emotional control that served her well in these situations. She'd faced actual enemies who wanted to kill her, so 3 spoiled college students hardly registered as a real threat. She continued to serve them politely, cleaned up their deliberately created messes, and endured their comments with the same stoic professionalism she'd maintained during military inspections. Her manager, Lisa Thompson, had noticed the pattern of harassment but felt helpless to intervene without clear evidence of wrongdoing. Rude customers weren't exactly grounds for banning people from the cafe, especially when those customers came from families with money and influence. Anna Chen, Emma's closest friend among the cafe staff, had urged her to stand up to the bullies or at least report their behavior to someone with authority. Anna was a psychology major who recognized the pattern of targeted harassment for what it was. She'd seen how Chad and his friends singled out Emma specifically, how their comments became more personal and cruel over time, and how they seemed to be testing her limits to see how far they could push before she snapped. But Emma had explained that she'd dealt with far worse than 3 privileged teenagers, and she wasn't about to let them see that their behavior affected her in any way. The truth was that their harassment did bother Emma, but not in the way they intended. What frustrated her wasn't their insults or their attempts to humiliate her. It was the waste of potential she saw in them. These were young men with every advantage in life, attending college on their family's money, with bright futures ahead of them if they chose to pursue them. Instead, they were spending their time and energy tormenting working people for their own amusement. Emma had served alongside Marines from wealthy families who'd chosen to serve their country despite having every opportunity to avoid sacrifice. The contrast between those Marines and these college students couldn't have been starker. Memorial Day weekend had arrived with the kind of perfect Southern California weather that made tourists understand why people paid premium prices to live there. The cafe was busier than usual, filled with families visiting their college-aged children and students who'd stayed on campus for the long weekend. Emma had volunteered to work extra shifts, partly because she needed the money, but mostly because she didn't have anywhere else to be. Memorial Day had always been important in the Rodriguez household, a time to honor Carlos's fallen comrades and remember the cost of freedom. This year, it felt different. This was Emma's first Memorial Day since her father's death, and she'd decided to honor his memory by wearing his Purple Heart visibly for the first time since the funeral. The medal hung on its chain outside her shirt, the bronze and purple ribbon catching the afternoon sunlight as she moved between tables. Several customers had noticed it and offered quiet words of respect and gratitude. An elderly veteran had stopped by her table while she was on break to share stories about his own service, and a young mother had thanked her for her sacrifice after noticing the medal. These interactions had warmed Emma's heart and made her feel connected to her father's memory in a way she hadn't experienced since his death. It was nearly 2:30 in the afternoon when Chad Williams arrived with his usual entourage. The outdoor seating area was crowded with families and couples enjoying the beautiful weather, and the three young men had to wait for a table to become available. Emma watched from behind the counter as they surveyed the scene, noting the way Chad's eyes landed on the families with obvious disdain. She could practically see him calculating whether these people were worth his time or if he should take his business elsewhere. When a table finally opened up in the far corner of the patio, Chad led his friends over and made a show of wiping down the chairs with napkins, as if the previous occupants had somehow contaminated the furniture. Emma gathered her order pad and headed over to take their drink orders, steeling herself for whatever new form of harassment they'd devised for today's visit. She was determined not to let them spoil what had been a meaningful and positive day. Chad looked up as she approached, and Emma saw his eyes immediately lock onto the purple heart hanging from her neck. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind of expression a predator might wear when spotting particularly vulnerable prey. Kyle and Mason noticed his reaction and followed his gaze, their own faces lighting up with anticipation as they realized their ringleader had found new ammunition for their cruel games. "Well, well," Chad said, his voice carrying clearly across the patio. "Look what we have here. Little Emma's playing dress-up today." He gestured toward the medal with mock solemnity. "Is that supposed to be a real military decoration, or did you pick it up at a costume shop?" Emma felt her jaw tighten, but she maintained her professional composure. "Good afternoon," she said evenly. "What can I get you gentlemen today?" Kyle pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is perfect," he said to Chad. "She's actually wearing fake military bling. This is going to get so many views. I bet she thinks people will thank her for her service if she wears that thing," Mason added, his voice dripping with disdain. "Like anyone's gonna believe a coffee shop worker is some kind of war hero." Chad leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "You know what, Emma? I'm curious about your little costume jewelry there. Where exactly did you serve? The great coffee wars of Riverside? Did you earn that medal for exceptional bravery in the face of a difficult latte order?" The other customers were beginning to notice the commotion. Emma could see people turning in their seats, some looking uncomfortable with the obvious harassment taking place. A family at the next table had stopped their conversation entirely and was watching the scene unfold with obvious concern.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Emma knew she had two choices. She could walk away and get Lisa to handle the situation, or she could stand her ground and risk escalating the confrontation. Her military training urged her to maintain discipline and follow proper channels, but something deeper, perhaps her father's spirit, told her that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. "This medal belonged to my father," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, United States Army. He died serving his country in Afghanistan." For a moment, the three young men seemed taken aback by the sincerity in her voice. But Chad recovered quickly, his cruelty apparently knowing no bounds. "Oh, how convenient," he said with theatrical sympathy. "The dead war hero father card. Let me guess. He died saving a school full of orphans while fighting off terrorists with his bare hands?" Kyle continued recording, zooming in on Emma's face to capture her reaction. "This is even better," he said excitedly. "She's got a whole backstory worked out. I bet she tells this sob story to everyone who questions her fake military credentials." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd faced genuine enemies who'd tried to kill her, but their hostility had been honest, a product of war and circumstance. This casual cruelty, this deliberate attempt to desecrate her father's memory for entertainment, was something else entirely. It was evil dressed up as fun, malice disguised as humor. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice taking on a tone that might have warned more perceptive individuals that they were venturing into dangerous territory, "I'm going to ask you once to show some respect. That medal represents a man who gave his life for this country, and I won't stand here while you mock his sacrifice." Chad stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the concrete. He was tall and athletic, probably used to intimidating people through sheer physical presence. "Or what?" he said, stepping closer to Emma. "You'll what? Call your manager? Report us to the Better Business Bureau?" He reached out and flicked the medal with his finger, causing it to swing on its chain. "Face it, Emma. You're nothing but a coffee shop worker with delusions of grandeur. This little costume piece doesn't make you special, and neither does whatever sob story you've invented about your daddy." The patio had gone completely silent now. Even the background noise from inside the cafe seemed muted as everyone within earshot focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. Emma could see Anna watching through the window, her face pale with concern. Tom Anderson, the part-time security guard, had emerged from inside and was moving slowly toward their table. But Emma knew that by the time anyone could intervene, the damage would already be done. Kyle had moved closer, still recording everything on his phone. "Hey, Chad," he said. "I dare you to take it from her. I bet it's not even a real military issue. Probably some cheap knockoff she bought online." Mason laughed nervously, clearly beginning to sense that the situation was spiraling beyond their usual harassment. "Maybe we should just order our drinks and—" "Shut up, Mason," Chad snapped. He turned back to Emma, his eyes bright with malicious excitement. "You know what? My friend Kyle has a point. If that's a real Purple Heart, it should have some kind of authentication, right? Military serial numbers or something." He reached for the medal again, this time grasping it firmly in his hand. "Why don't we take a closer look?" Emma's hand shot up to stop him, but Chad was already pulling the chain toward himself. The clasp wasn't designed to withstand that kind of force, and Emma felt it break against the back of her neck. The medal fell toward the ground, but Chad caught it in his palm, grinning triumphantly. "Chad, give it back," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time since the harassment began, she felt truly vulnerable. The medal wasn't just jewelry or even just a memento. It was the physical embodiment of her father's sacrifice, the tangible proof that his life and death had meant something. "What's the matter, Emma?" Chad taunted, holding the medal up to examine it. "Worried I'll expose your little fraud?" He turned to his friends. "Look at this thing. It doesn't even look authentic. The ribbon's all faded, and the medal looks cheap." "That's because it's 60 years old," Emma said desperately. "Please, just give it back." "It's all I have left of him." Chad's smile widened. "All you have left of your imaginary war hero, Daddy?" He tossed the medal to Kyle, who caught it and immediately began examining it under his phone's camera light. "This is definitely fake," Kyle announced. "Look how scratched up it is. A real Purple Heart would be in better condition." Emma felt her world narrowing to a single point of focus. Everything else, the watching customers, the afternoon sunlight, the distant sounds of traffic, faded away until there was only Chad Williams and the medal that represented everything she'd lost. Her military training was screaming warnings about maintaining composure and following proper procedures, but a deeper part of her, the part that had inherited Carlos Rodriguez's fierce protective instincts, was demanding action. "Kyle, throw it here," Chad called out, reaching for the medal. Kyle tossed it back carelessly, and Emma watched in horror as Chad fumbled the catch. The Purple Heart fell to the concrete patio with a soft clink, the impact leaving a visible scratch across the bronze surface. "Oops," Chad said with mock concern. "Looks like your precious medal isn't as durable as you thought." He bent down and picked it up, examining the new damage with apparent satisfaction. "You know what, Emma? I think this little trinket needs a proper inspection." Without warning, Chad raised his foot and brought it down hard on the metal, grinding his heel into it as Emma lunged forward. The sound of metal scraping against concrete filled the air, followed by Emma's sharp cry of anguish. When Chad finally lifted his foot, the Purple Heart lay twisted and scarred, its ribbon torn and its surface bearing the permanent marks of his deliberate cruelty. Emma dropped to her knees and gently picked up the damaged metal, cradling it in her palms like a wounded bird. The sight of her father's honor desecrated by this spoiled child's malice was more than she could bear. Years of military discipline, months of enduring harassment, and a lifetime of keeping her emotions in check suddenly meant nothing in the face of this ultimate violation. "You have no idea what you've just done," Emma said, her voice so quiet that only Chad could hear her. When she looked up at him, something had changed in her eyes, something that should have warned him that he'd just crossed a line from which there would be no return. But Chad Williams had never learned to recognize real danger. He'd spent his entire life insulated from the consequences of his actions by his family's wealth and influence. Standing over Emma as she knelt on the concrete, he felt only the intoxicating rush of absolute power over someone he perceived as helpless. "What I've done," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is expose you for the fraud you are. That piece of junk isn't worth the metal it's made from, just like your whole sob story about being some kind of military hero." Emma rose slowly to her feet, the damaged metal still cradled in her hands. Around them, the patio remained frozen in horrified silence, as if everyone present sensed that they were about to witness something that would change the trajectory of several lives forever. What Chad Williams didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the quiet barista they'd been tormenting for months was about to remind them that some people's training runs much deeper than customer service skills. Emma Rodriguez had spent 2 years learning how to neutralize threats efficiently and decisively, and 3 spoiled college students were about to discover exactly what that meant. The afternoon sun continued to shine down on Mountain View Café, but the day was about to take a turn that none of them would ever forget. The weight of the damaged Purple Heart in Emma's hands felt heavier than any weapon she'd ever carried. Each scratch on its surface told a story of deliberate cruelty that went beyond simple bullying into something far more sinister. Chad Williams stood above her with the satisfied smirk of someone who believed he'd just won a decisive victory, completely unaware that he'd actually lit a fuse on something explosive. Tom Anderson, the security guard, had finally reached the edge of the patio area, but his years of dealing with rowdy college students hadn't prepared him for a situation quite like this. He could see the tension radiating from Emma's rigid posture, could hear the uncomfortable murmurs from other customers, but he hesitated to intervene in what appeared to be a verbal dispute between a worker and difficult customers. His hesitation would prove to be a critical mistake. Anna Chen pressed her face against the cafe window, her psychology training allowing her to recognize the dangerous shift in group dynamics playing out on the patio. She'd studied enough about trauma responses and breaking points to understand that Emma wasn't just angry about destroyed property. The careful emotional control that had defined Emma's personality for months was showing hairline fractures, and Anna could practically see the moment when those fractures would become complete breaks. Kyle Bennett continued recording with his phone, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was documenting what would soon become evidence in a criminal case. His pre-law courses had taught him about civil liability and criminal prosecution, but his privileged upbringing had convinced him that such consequences only applied to other people. The irony of a future lawyer creating a permanent record of his own misconduct would have been amusing if the situation weren't so tragic. Mason Davis fidgeted nervously in his chair, his survival instincts finally beginning to register what his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. Unlike his companions, Mason had grown up with an older brother who'd served in the military, and something about Emma's stillness reminded him of stories his brother had told about combat veterans. But peer pressure and his desperate need for Chad's approval kept him silent, even as every fiber of his being urged him to distance himself from what was about to unfold. Dr. Sarah Chen, a retired Army medic who was enjoying coffee with her granddaughter at a nearby table, had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm. Her military experience had taught her to recognize the signs of someone approaching their breaking point, and she could see all of those signs in Emma's rigid posture and controlled breathing. More importantly, she could see the confidence and training in Emma's movements that suggested this young woman was far more dangerous than her civilian appearance indicated. The family at the table closest to the confrontation had already begun gathering their belongings, the parents recognizing that whatever was happening needed more space and fewer witnesses. Their teenage daughter kept glancing between Emma and Chad with the fascinated horror of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. She'd later tell investigators that she could see the exact moment when Emma Rodriguez stopped being a service worker and became something else entirely. Emma rose from her crouch with the fluid grace of someone whose movements had been honed by thousands of hours of combat training. To untrained observers, she simply stood up. To anyone with military or law enforcement experience, her motion carried the unmistakable signature of someone transitioning from a defensive position to an offensive stance. The change was subtle but profound, like watching a house cat transform into a tiger. Chad apparently noticed none of these warning signs. Drunk on his own perceived power and the attention of his recording audience, he decided to escalate the humiliation even further. "You know what, Emma?" he said, his voice carrying across the now silent patio. "I think I'm going to keep this little trinket as a souvenir. Consider it payment for all the terrible coffee you've served me this semester. He slipped the damaged Purple Heart into his jacket pocket with theatrical ceremony, patting the fabric to ensure everyone could see where he'd placed it. The gesture was designed to be the ultimate insult, the final demonstration of his complete power over someone he considered beneath his notice. What it actually accomplished was removing the last restraint on Emma's rapidly fraying self-control. Give it back. Emma's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried more menace than if she'd shouted. The tone was flat and emotionless, the kind of voice that people used when they'd moved beyond anger into something far more dangerous. Military personnel would have recognized it as the voice of someone who'd shifted into tactical mode, where emotion became a luxury that could get you killed. Chad laughed and turned to his friends for validation. Did you hear that? She's making demands now. I think all this attention has gone to her head. He pulled out his wallet and tossed a $20 bill onto the table with exaggerated carelessness. Tell you what, Emma, I'll buy your little costume jewelry for $20. That's probably more than you paid for it anyway. Kyle zoomed his camera in on Emma's face, hoping to capture what he expected would be tears or pleading. Instead, he found himself looking into eyes that seemed to have gone completely dead, as if whatever made Emma Rodriguez human had temporarily departed, leaving behind something purely functional and utterly without mercy. He would later tell police that looking into those eyes was like staring into the barrel of a loaded gun. The transformation in Emma's demeanor was so complete that even customers who hadn't been paying attention to the confrontation began to notice that something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. Conversations died mid-sentence as people found themselves unconsciously holding their breath, as if their primitive survival instincts had detected a predator in their midst. Emma took a step toward Chad, and something in her movement made him unconsciously step backward. For the first time since the confrontation began, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. He was still operating under the assumption that his physical size and social status made him untouchable, but some deeper part of his brain was beginning to recognize that he might have miscalculated the situation. I said, give it back, Emma repeated, taking another step forward. Her hands hung loose at her sides, but there was something about her posture that suggested she was ready to move in any direction with lethal efficiency. Chad's height and weight advantage, which had seemed so intimidating moments before, suddenly appeared irrelevant against someone who radiated the kind of controlled violence that could only come from professional training. Or what? Chad demanded, though his voice lacked the confident arrogance it had carried moments before. You'll call your manager? File a complaint with corporate? He gestured toward the other customers with forced bravado. There are witnesses here, Emma. You can't do anything to me without destroying your precious little job. What Chad failed to understand was that Emma had already moved far beyond caring about her job, her public image, or the social consequences of her actions. In her mind, she was no longer a barista dealing with difficult customers. She was a Marine whose enemy had desecrated the memory of a fallen comrade, and that was an offense that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. Tom Anderson finally decided to intervene, stepping onto the patio with his hands raised in what he hoped was a calming gesture. Hey folks, let's all just take a deep breath here, he said in the carefully neutral tone he'd learned during his security training. I'm sure we can work this out without anyone getting hurt. Emma's gaze flicked to Tom for just a moment, and he found himself stopping mid-step. Something in her expression communicated more clearly than words that his intervention was neither wanted nor wise. Tom had served as a military police officer before taking the security job, and his combat experience told him that he was looking at someone who had already made the transition from civilian to combatant. Getting between Emma and her target would likely result in him becoming collateral damage. Chad, however, interpreted Tom's hesitation as confirmation of his own invulnerability. See that, Emma? Even security knows you can't touch me. Face it. You're nothing but a coffee shop worker having a temper tantrum because someone exposed your little fantasy. He pulled the Purple Heart partway out of his pocket, dangling it tauntingly. Maybe I'll put this on eBay. I bet I could get $50 for authentic military memorabilia. The comment about selling her father's medal was the final straw that broke Emma's remaining restraint. Later military psychologists would explain that combat veterans often experienced a phenomenon called mission override, where training and protective instincts completely superseded civilian social conditioning. Emma Rodriguez had just experienced that override. And Chad Williams was about to discover what it meant to face someone for whom violence was not just an option but a precisely calibrated tool. Emma's movement was so fast that most witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly what they'd seen. One moment she was standing 3 feet away from Chad, the next she was inside his personal space with her hand locked around his wrist in a grip that made him gasp in surprise and pain. The speed and precision of her movement demonstrated years of close-quarters combat training, the kind of muscle memory that only came from countless repetitions under stress. "Last chance," Emma said quietly, her face inches from Chad's. "Give me back my father's medal, and we can pretend this never happened." Chad tried to pull his wrist free and discovered that Emma's grip was like a steel manacle. Panic began to replace arrogance as he realized that his assumptions about his own physical dominance had been catastrophically wrong. "Let go of me," he demanded, though his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. "Your assault." Emma's free hand moved with surgical precision, finding a pressure point on Chad's neck that made his knees buckle involuntarily. The technique was designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage, but the sudden loss of control over his own body terrified Chad in a way that mere physical pain never could. For the first time in his privileged life, he found himself completely helpless in the face of someone else's superior skill and training. Kyle continued recording, but his hands were shaking now as he began to understand that he wasn't documenting harmless fun anymore. He was creating evidence of what appeared to be a trained fighter systematically dismantling his friend's illusion of invincibility. His pre-law education told him he should probably stop filming and call the police, but morbid fascination kept his camera trained on the unfolding scene. Mason finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a terrified whisper. "Chad, just give her the medal back. This isn't worth it." His older brother's military stories had included enough details about hand-to-hand combat training to help him recognize that Emma possessed skills that could seriously injure all three of them before anyone could stop her. But Chad's ego refused to allow him to back down, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that he was outclassed. Years of having his way through intimidation and money had created a psychological framework that couldn't process the reality of meeting someone who was completely immune to both. "I'm not giving this crazy woman anything," he gasped, trying unsuccessfully to break Emma's grip. "Someone call the cops. She's attacking me." Dr. Sarah Chen had seen enough. Rising from her table, she approached the confrontation with the calm authority of someone accustomed to dealing with crisis situations. "Young man," she said to Chad in a voice that brooked no argument, "I suggest you return whatever you took from this young woman immediately. I'm a retired Army medic, and I can see that she has combat training. You are approximately 30 seconds away from requiring serious medical attention." Her intervention might have diffused the situation if Chad had possessed the wisdom to listen. Instead, he made the fatal mistake of interpreting her calm demeanor as weakness. "Mind your own business, lady," he snarled. "This doesn't concern you." Dr. Chen's expression hardened. As a veteran herself, she understood the significance of what Chad had done far better than the college students who saw it as merely destructive mischief. "Actually," she said coldly, "desecrating a Purple Heart concerns every veteran in this country. You've dishonored a man who died serving people like you." The gathered crowd was growing larger as customers from inside the cafe emerged to see what was causing the commotion. Anna Chen had given up her position at the window and was now standing at the edge of the patio, torn between her desire to help Emma and her recognition that any intervention might make the situation worse. She could see that Emma had entered some kind of dissociative state where normal social rules no longer applied. Lisa Thompson, the cafe manager, finally appeared after being summoned by increasingly frantic reports from her staff. She took one look at the scene, Emma maintaining a combat grip on a customer while a crowd of witnesses watched in fascinated horror, and realized that she was completely unprepared to handle whatever was happening. Her management training had covered difficult customers and workplace disputes, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what appeared to be a former soldier having a psychological break. "Emma," Lisa said tentatively, approaching slowly with her hands visible. "Maybe we should all just calm down and—" "Stay back, Lisa," Emma said without turning her head. Her voice carried an authority that made the manager stop immediately. "This doesn't involve you." Chad made another attempt to break free, this time trying to use his weight advantage to overpower Emma's grip. The effort was not only unsuccessful but seemed to trigger an escalation in Emma's response. Her hand position shifted slightly, and Chad found himself fighting not just to escape, but to remain conscious as pressure on his carotid artery began to affect his blood flow. "Please," he gasped, his earlier arrogance finally giving way to genuine fear. "I can't breathe." Emma's grip loosened just enough to restore full circulation, but her control over the situation remained absolute. "My father's medal," she said with the patience of someone explaining something to a slow child. "Return it now, and I'll let you walk away from this." Kyle had finally stopped recording, his phone forgotten in his hand, as he watched his friend's confident facade crumble under the demonstration of superior training and discipline. The video he'd captured would become crucial evidence in the subsequent investigation, but at that moment, all he could think about was how quickly the situation had spiraled beyond their control. The silence on the patio was broken by the distant sound of sirens as someone had finally called the police. Whether it was a concerned customer, a staff member, or Tom Anderson exercising his security protocols was unclear, but the approaching authorities would add a new dynamic to an already complex situation. Emma seemed to register the sound without any change in her expression or grip on Chad. "Hear that?" she said conversationally. "That's the police coming to sort this out. You have about 2 minutes to decide whether you want to explain to them why you stole a Purple Heart from a veteran, or whether you want to return my father's medal and pretend this never happened." Chad's mind raced through his options as the sirens grew louder. His father's money and connections could probably make most legal problems disappear, but the video evidence and multiple witnesses would make this particular incident difficult to explain away. More immediately concerning was his growing realization that Emma Rodriguez possessed the skills and apparent willingness to cause him serious physical harm before the police could arrive. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Okay, you win. Just please let me go." Emma studied his face for a moment as if evaluating the sincerity of his surrender. Apparently satisfied with what she saw, she released her grip on his wrist and stepped back, though her posture remained ready for immediate action. Chad stumbled backward, massaging his wrist and staring at Emma with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. With shaking hands, Chad reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the damaged Purple Heart. He held it out to Emma as if it were a live grenade, his earlier casual cruelty replaced by reverent caution. Emma took the medal gently, cradling it in her palms and examining the additional damage it had sustained during the confrontation. The approaching police sirens were now clearly audible to everyone on the patio, and the reality of potential legal consequences was beginning to penetrate the adrenaline-fueled haze that had dominated the last few minutes. Chad, Kyle, and Mason huddled together, probably trying to coordinate their version of events before the authorities arrived. Emma remained standing where Chad had left her, seemingly oblivious to everything except the damaged medal in her hands. Dr. Chad approached Emma cautiously, her medical training alerting her to the signs of someone experiencing post-adrenaline crash. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked gently. Emma looked up, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to fully register her surroundings. The crowd of witnesses, the overturned chairs, the approaching sirens, all of it seemed to penetrate her consciousness simultaneously. The emotional control that had carried her through the physical confrontation began to crack as the full implications of what had just happened settled over her. "They destroyed it," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of bewilderment. "They destroyed the last thing I had of him." Dr. Chen's heart broke a little as she recognized the grief and trauma underlying Emma's earlier violence. "May I see it?" she asked gently. Emma extended her hands, revealing the twisted and scratched Purple Heart. Dr. Chen examined it with the reverence due to such a significant military decoration, her experienced eyes cataloging the damage while also noting the medal's authenticity and age. "The ribbon can be replaced," she said softly. "The scratches can be polished out. Your father's sacrifice. What this medal represents that can never be destroyed by ignorant children." Emma nodded, though tears were beginning to form in her eyes. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and the crushing weight of grief that she'd been carrying since her father's death. For months, she'd managed to maintain her emotional equilibrium through routine and discipline, but Chad's casual cruelty had shattered the careful barriers she'd constructed around her pain. The police cars pulled into the cafe's parking lot with lights flashing but sirens now silent. Through the window, Emma could see officers emerging from their vehicles and speaking briefly with someone, probably Tom Anderson, before heading toward the patio. In a few moments, she would have to explain her actions to people who might or might not understand the significance of what had transpired. As the officers approached, Emma straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. Whatever consequences awaited her, she knew she would face them with the same dignity and honor that had defined her father's service. The metal in her hands might be damaged, but the values it represented remained intact. Officer Detective Sarah Murphy stepped onto the patio with the measured gait of someone who had responded to thousands of disturbance calls during her 15-year career with the Riverside Police Department. Her partner, Officer Jake Martinez, flanked her right side, while Officer Rebecca Torres positioned herself near the cafe's main entrance to control the growing crowd of onlookers. Detective Murphy's experienced eyes quickly cataloged the scene. Overturned furniture, a visibly shaken group of college-aged males, multiple witnesses with their phones out, and a young woman standing in the center of it all holding what appeared to be some kind of military decoration. The 911 calls had described everything from a violent assault in progress to a terrorist attack at the coffee shop, but Murphy's initial assessment suggested something far more nuanced than either extreme. The alleged perpetrator wasn't attempting to flee or hide evidence, the supposed victims didn't appear to have sustained any serious injuries, and the numerous witnesses seemed more confused than traumatized. These were the hallmarks of a situation where the surface facts wouldn't tell the complete story. Anna Chen intercepted Detective Murphy before she could reach Emma, her psychology training having prepared her to serve as a bridge between emotionally compromised individuals and authority figures. "Officer, please be careful with her," Anna said urgently. "She's a military veteran, and those boys have been harassing her for months. They destroyed something very important to her." Murphy nodded her acknowledgement but didn't break stride. Her own brother had served 3 tours in Iraq before coming home with PTSD, and she'd learned to recognize the signs of veterans struggling with civilian reintegration. The young woman standing motionless in the center of the patio displayed several of those indicators: hypervigilance, controlled breathing, and the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much violence at too young an age. Chad Williams was massaging his wrist and whispering frantically to his companions when Detective Murphy approached their table. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone who was beginning to understand that his family's money and connections might not be sufficient to extract him from this particular situation. Kyle Bennett was staring at his phone screen, probably reviewing the video he'd recorded, while Mason Davis appeared to be in a state of near shock. "Gentlemen," Detective Murphy said with professional courtesy, "I'm going to need to speak with each of you individually about what happened here today. Officer Martinez will take your initial statements while I assess the situation." Chad immediately began talking, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to establish his version of events. "Officer, thank God you're here. That woman attacked me for no reason. She grabbed me and threatened me, and she damaged my property. I want to press charges for assault and—" "Sir," Murphy interrupted firmly, "you'll have plenty of opportunity to tell your story. Right now, I need you to remain calm and wait for Officer Martinez." She turned her attention to the young woman holding the military decoration, noting the way Emma's posture suggested someone ready for combat, despite her civilian clothes and cafe apron. Emma had been watching the police officer's approach with the analytical detachment of someone conducting a tactical assessment. She'd noted their positioning, their equipment, and their apparent experience level within seconds of their arrival. More importantly, she'd recognized something in Detective Murphy's bearing that suggested military or law enforcement background beyond basic police training. The detective moved with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with violence before and wasn't easily intimidated or misled. "Ma'am," Murphy said as she approached Emma, "I'm Detective Sarah Murphy with Riverside PD. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Emma's response was immediate and professional. "No, ma'am. I'm uninjured." Emma Rodriguez, former Lance Corporal, United States Marine Corps. The automatic military courtesy in her reply told Murphy volumes about Emma's background and current mental state. This was someone who defaulted to military protocol under stress, which suggested both significant training and potential psychological vulnerabilities. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, Murphy replied, deliberately using Emma's military rank to establish rapport and show respect. Can you tell me what happened here today? Emma's account was delivered with the precise, factual style of a military after-action report. She described the months of escalating harassment, the significance of her father's Purple Heart, and the events that had led to the physical confrontation. Her narrative was devoid of emotional embellishment or attempts at self-justification, presenting only the facts as she remembered them. The clinical nature of her report actually made it more credible than if she'd tried to elicit sympathy or minimize her actions. Dr. Sarah Chen had remained nearby throughout the police intervention, her medical training and veteran status making her feel responsible for ensuring that Emma received appropriate support. When Detective Murphy asked if there were any independent witnesses to the events, Dr. Chen stepped forward with the authority of someone accustomed to providing expert testimony. "Detective," Dr. Chen said, introducing herself with her military credentials, "I observed the entire incident from beginning to end. I can provide you with an objective account of what transpired." Her medical background and veteran status gave her testimony significant weight, particularly when she described the deliberate nature of the harassment and the provocation that had triggered Emma's response. Tom Anderson also provided his statement, though his account was complicated by his acknowledgement that he'd hesitated to intervene, despite recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond normal customer service issues. His security training had taught him to avoid physical confrontations when possible, but his military background had also warned him that Emma Rodriguez was someone whose capabilities far exceeded her apparent civilian role. Lisa Thompson's statement focused on the pattern of harassment that Chad and his friends had directed toward Emma over the previous months. As the cafe manager, she'd documented several incidents but had felt powerless to ban customers without clear evidence of illegal behavior. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing the context of escalating abuse that had preceded the day's events. The most damaging evidence against Chad, Kyle, and Mason came from Kyle's own phone recording. Detective Murphy reviewed the video footage on the spot, watching Chad's deliberate destruction of the Purple Heart and his subsequent theft of the damaged metal. The recording clearly showed Emma's restraint throughout most of the harassment and captured the moment when Chad's actions crossed the line from cruel pranks into criminal behavior. Officer Martinez had been taking statements from the 3 college students, and their stories began to contradict each other almost immediately. Chad insisted that Emma had attacked him without provocation, but Kyle's video evidence showed otherwise. Mason's account diverged from both of his friends' versions, particularly regarding their knowledge of the metal's significance and their intent in targeting Emma specifically. Detective Murphy found herself dealing with a case that was simultaneously straightforward and complex. The video evidence clearly showed theft and destruction of property, followed by a physical confrontation that appeared to be justified self-defense. However, the underlying issues of harassment, veteran mental health, and the symbolic significance of military decorations added layers of complexity that would require careful investigation. Emma remained standing where the confrontation had ended, still holding her father's damaged Purple Heart. Her emotional state was becoming increasingly fragile as the adrenaline wore off and the full impact of the day's events settled over her. Dr. Chen stayed close by, recognizing the signs of someone approaching emotional collapse and ready to provide medical intervention if necessary. The growing crowd of witnesses presented another challenge for the responding officers. Many customers had recorded portions of the incident on their phones, creating multiple angles of evidence that would need to be collected and reviewed. Social media posts were already beginning to appear, with hashtags like #VeteranJustice and #PurpleHeartDefender starting to trend locally. Chad's father arrived on the scene within 30 minutes of the police response, having been contacted by his son immediately after the incident. Richard Williams was a prominent businessman whose first instinct was to minimize his son's involvement and shift blame to Emma. His approach to Detective Murphy was a masterclass in entitled arrogance, demanding that charges be filed against Emma while threatening legal action if his son faced any consequences. "Detective," Richard Williams announced in the tone of someone accustomed to having his demands met immediately, "I want that woman arrested for assault. My son was viciously attacked while trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon with his friends. This is clearly a case of an unstable veteran having a psychotic break and endangering innocent civilians." Murphy's response was professionally neutral, but carried an edge that suggested she wasn't impressed by Williams' approach. "Mr. Williams, I understand your concern for your son's welfare. However, we need to complete our investigation before determining what charges, if any, will be filed. The arrival of Chad's father seemed to restore some of his earlier arrogance. Do you know who I am, detective? I employ half the city council and contribute significantly to the police benevolent fund. I expect this matter to be handled appropriately. Detective Murphy had encountered entitled parents many times during her career, but she found Richard Williams particularly distasteful given the circumstances of the case. His immediate assumption that his money and connections could override justice was exactly the kind of privilege that had enabled his son's behavior in the first place. Emma's mother, Maria Rodriguez, arrived shortly after being contacted by Anna Chen. Unlike Richard Williams, Maria approached the scene with quiet dignity and genuine concern for all parties involved. Her first priority was ensuring that Emma was physically and emotionally stable. But she also expressed sympathy for the young men who had found themselves on the receiving end of her daughter's military training. "My Emma is a good girl," Maria told Detective Murphy in accented English. "She loved her father very much. That medal, it's all we have left of him. These boys, they don't understand what it means to lose someone who died for this country." The contrast between the two families' responses to the incident was stark and telling. Where Richard Williams demanded immediate action to protect his son from consequences, Maria Rodriguez focused on understanding what had driven her daughter to violence and ensuring that everyone involved could move forward constructively. Dr. James Carter, the emergency room physician on duty at Riverside General Hospital, had been monitoring police radio traffic and arrived at the scene to offer medical assistance. His presence proved fortunate when Mason Davis began showing signs of a panic attack, hyperventilating and experiencing chest pains that required immediate attention. The irony of Emma's victim requiring medical care while Emma herself remained physically unharmed was not lost on the assembled witnesses. Kyle Bennett finally stopped recording and put away his phone, but not before Detective Murphy had secured a copy of his footage for evidence. His pre-law education was beginning to help him understand the serious legal jeopardy that all three young men now faced. Theft, destruction of property, harassment, and potentially hate crime charges could result in criminal records that would destroy their academic and professional futures. Anna Chen provided Detective Murphy with additional context about Emma's adjustment to civilian life, describing her friend's dedication to her job and her plans to pursue a career in law enforcement. Anna's psychology training allowed her to articulate the complex trauma responses that many veterans experienced when transitioning from military to civilian life, particularly those who had lost family members during their service. The cafe security cameras had captured portions of the incident from different angles, providing additional evidence that corroborated the witness statements and Kyle's phone recording. Tom Anderson worked with the police to download the footage, which showed the escalating pattern of harassment that had preceded the day's confrontation. Detective Murphy was beginning to form a clear picture of what had transpired, but she also recognized that the case raised larger questions about veteran support services, campus harassment policies, and the responsibilities of businesses to protect their employees from abusive customers. Emma's response to the provocation was arguably justified, but it also highlighted the potential dangers when trained combat veterans reach their breaking points in civilian settings. Emma herself remained largely silent throughout the investigation, answering questions when asked but offering no additional commentary or attempts at self-justification. Her behavior was consistent with someone experiencing post-traumatic stress, but it also reflected the military training that emphasized facts over emotions and accountability over excuses. The damaged Purple Heart became a central focus of the investigation, with Dr. Chen providing expert testimony about its historical significance and the proper protocols for handling military decorations. Her explanation of what the medal represented and why its desecration was so traumatic for Emma helped the responding officers understand that this wasn't simply a case of property damage, but an attack on fundamental values of honor and sacrifice. Richard Williams' increasingly aggressive demands for immediate action against Emma began to backfire as Detective Murphy's investigation revealed the extent of his son's harassment campaign. The video evidence showing Chad's deliberate destruction of the Purple Heart was particularly damaging, as it demonstrated clear intent to cause emotional harm beyond mere property damage. Chad himself seemed to be experiencing the first real consequences of his actions in his 19 years of life. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated as he realized that his father's money and connections couldn't erase video evidence or make multiple witnesses forget what they'd seen. The physical demonstration of Emma's superior training had also shattered his illusions about his own invulnerability. Kyle Bennett was facing the additional complication of having created evidence of his own participation in the harassment. His recorded commentary during the incident would likely be used to establish premeditation and intent to humiliate Emma, potentially elevating simple harassment charges to more serious offenses. Mason Davis required medical transport to Riverside General Hospital for treatment of his panic attack and evaluation for potential cardiac issues related to stress. His participation in the harassment had been more passive than his friends, but his presence during the incident and failure to intervene would still likely result in legal consequences. As the immediate crisis stabilized, Detective Murphy began the process of determining what charges, if any, would be filed against the various parties. The evidence clearly supported theft and destruction of property charges against Chad, with possible harassment and conspiracy charges against all three young men. Emma's actions appeared to fall within the bounds of justified response to theft and provocation, though the extent of her military training raised questions about proportional force. The incident had also attracted the attention of local veterans organizations, who began arriving at the scene to show support for Emma and demand justice for the desecration of her father's Purple Heart. Their presence added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation, as Detective Murphy had to balance law enforcement needs with community concerns and media attention. Emma's commanding officer from her last duty station, Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, had been contacted through military channels and was en route to provide character testimony and support. His arrival would add crucial context about Emma's service record and the circumstances surrounding her father's death, information that would be vital in understanding her emotional state during the confrontation. The cafe itself had become a crime scene, with the patio area cordoned off while evidence was collected and statements were taken. Lisa Thompson was dealing with the business implications of the incident while also trying to support her employee, recognizing that Emma's actions, while understandable, had created significant complications for the establishment. As Detective Murphy continued her investigation, it became increasingly clear that this case would serve as a test of the justice system's ability to balance veteran trauma, civilian safety, and accountability for all parties involved. The outcome would likely have implications far beyond the individual participants, potentially influencing policies regarding veteran support services and harassment prevention in academic and workplace settings. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres arrived at Mountain View Café in full-dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of 2 decades of distinguished military service. His presence immediately shifted the dynamics of the investigation, as Detective Murphy recognized the authority and gravitas that came with his rank and obvious combat experience. Torres had driven straight from Camp Pendleton after receiving word that one of his former Marines was involved in a serious incident, and his first concern was ensuring that Emma Rodriguez received the support and advocacy she deserved. Torres approached Emma with the careful demeanor of someone who understood trauma and its aftermath. "Rodriguez," he said gently, using her surname in the military tradition that conveyed both respect and familiarity. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you holding up?" Emma's response was immediate and instinctive, her posture straightening into military bearing despite her emotional exhaustion. "Sergeant Torres, sir." "I'm managing." The simple exchange communicated volumes about their relationship and Emma's current state of mind, showing Detective Murphy that this was a veteran who maintained her military identity even in civilian settings. Torres examined the damaged Purple Heart with the reverence of someone who understood its significance beyond mere monetary value. His weathered hands traced the scratches and dents inflicted by Chad's deliberate abuse, and his expression hardened as he absorbed the full extent of the desecration. "Tell me what happened, Marine," he said quietly, and Emma provided him with the same factual account she'd given Detective Murphy, though her voice carried more emotion when speaking to her former superior. The arrival of Torres also brought additional context about Emma's military service that had been missing from the investigation. He explained to Detective Murphy that Emma had served with distinction in Afghanistan, earning commendations for her work with military police units and her dedication to protecting civilian populations. Her father's death had devastated her, but she'd completed her tour with professionalism and honor before choosing not to re-enlist. "Rodriguez was one of our finest," Torres told Detective Murphy, 2 tours, spotless record, natural leader. She could have been a lifer if personal circumstances hadn't intervened. What happened here today doesn't represent who she is as a person or a Marine. Dr. James Carter returned from the hospital with updates on Mason Davis's condition and additional perspective on the incident. Mason had suffered a severe panic attack but was medically stable, though his psychological state remained fragile. During his treatment, Mason had confided to hospital staff about his growing discomfort with Chad and Kyle's escalating harassment of Emma, admitting that he'd wanted to speak up but lacked the courage to confront his friends. The revelation that even one of the perpetrators had recognized the harassment as wrong added another layer to Detective Murphy's understanding of the group dynamics that had led to the confrontation. Mason's statement, given to hospital social workers under medical privilege, suggested that Chad had been the primary instigator, while Kyle had served as an enabler and documentarian of the abuse. Richard Williams had continued his aggressive campaign to have Emma arrested, but his efforts were increasingly counterproductive as more evidence emerged about his son's behavior. The video footage and witness statements painted a clear picture of deliberate harassment and criminal destruction of property that couldn't be dismissed regardless of the Williams family's social connections. Detective Murphy's patience with Richard Williams finally reached its limit when he attempted to argue that Emma's military training made her response disproportionate to the provocation. "Mr. Williams," she said with cold professionalism, "your son stole and destroyed a Purple Heart belonging to a fallen soldier. The fact that his victim was trained to defend herself doesn't make his actions less criminal." The arrival of representatives from local veterans organizations had created a media presence that Richard Williams clearly hadn't anticipated. Veterans from multiple conflicts and service branches had gathered to show support for Emma and demand justice for the desecration of her father's medal. Their presence transformed what Richard Williams had hoped would be a quiet incident into a public relations nightmare for his family. Commander Robert Mitchell, a retired Navy officer who led the Riverside Veterans Council, approached Detective Murphy with an offer to provide expert testimony about the significance of military decorations and the psychological impact of their desecration on veterans and their families. His organization had dealt with similar cases across the country and could provide context about the broader implications of the incident. The media attention was growing beyond local coverage as social media posts about the incident began attracting national attention. Hashtags supporting Emma and condemning the destruction of her father's medal were trending across multiple platforms, with veterans groups and military families sharing their own stories of harassment and disrespect. Anna Chen had been providing emotional support to Emma throughout the investigation, but she was also documenting the incident for potential civil rights and harassment complaints. Her psychology background helped her recognize the systematic nature of the abuse Emma had endured and the long-term psychological damage it could cause to veterans struggling with civilian reintegration. Lisa Thompson faced difficult decisions about the cafe's response to the incident. While she supported Emma completely, she also had to consider the business implications of the confrontation and the media attention it was generating. Her statement to Detective Murphy emphasized Emma's exemplary performance as an employee and her professional handling of difficult customers in the past. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Officer Martinez discovered that Chad Williams had a history of harassment complaints from his university. 3 female students had filed reports about his behavior over the previous semester, describing a pattern of entitled abuse toward anyone he perceived as socially inferior. The complaints had been handled through university administrative channels rather than criminal prosecution, but they established a clear pattern of predatory behavior. Kyle Bennett's phone contained additional evidence beyond the video of the confrontation. His social media accounts showed months of posts mocking service workers, veterans, and anyone he considered beneath his social status. Several posts specifically targeted Emma, including photos taken without her consent and derogatory comments about her appearance and background. Dr. Sarah Chen provided Detective Murphy with a detailed analysis of the psychological dynamics that had led to the confrontation, explaining how systematic harassment could trigger trauma responses in veterans, and why Emma's reaction, while extreme, was understandable given the provocation and her military background. Her testimony would prove crucial in any legal proceedings that followed. The Purple Heart itself became a focal point for the community response to the incident. Local veterans offered to contribute toward its restoration, while military jewelers volunteered their services to repair the damage inflicted by Chad's abuse. The medal's physical damage could be repaired, but its symbolic significance as a target of deliberate cruelty resonated deeply with the veteran community. Sergeant Torres worked with Detective Murphy to contact Emma's former commanding officers and obtain her complete military record, which painted a picture of exceptional service and personal sacrifice. Her performance evaluations were outstanding, her conduct record was spotless, and her dedication to her fellow Marines was consistently noted by superiors. Maria Rodriguez had remained at her daughter's side throughout the investigation, providing quiet support while dealing with her own grief about her husband's medal being damaged. Her dignity and grace under pressure contrasted sharply with Richard Williams' aggressive demands, showing Detective Murphy the difference between families that understood sacrifice and those that had never faced real hardship. The investigation revealed that Chad, Kyle, and Mason had specifically targeted Emma because they perceived her as vulnerable and unlikely to retaliate. Their harassment had escalated over time as they tested her limits, apparently viewing her restraint as weakness rather than professionalism. The systematic nature of their abuse elevated their actions beyond simple pranks into criminal harassment. Tom Anderson's security footage revealed additional incidents of harassment that Emma had never reported, showing Chad and his friends deliberately creating messes for her to clean up, making inappropriate comments about her appearance, and generally treating her with contempt. The footage established a clear pattern of abuse that contradicted their claims of innocent interaction. Detective Murphy consulted with the district attorney's office about potential charges, discussing everything from theft and destruction of property to hate crimes and criminal harassment. The strength of the evidence and the public attention surrounding the case made prosecution likely, though the specific charges would depend on the DA's assessment of what could be proven in court. The incident had exposed larger issues about veteran support services and the challenges faced by former military personnel transitioning to civilian life. Emma's case became a catalyst for discussions about workplace harassment policies, veteran mental health resources, and the responsibilities of educational institutions to address student misconduct. Chad Williams was ultimately charged with theft, destruction of property, and criminal harassment. Kyle Bennett faced charges related to conspiracy and invasion of privacy for his unauthorized recording and posting of images. Mason Davis received the most lenient treatment due to his cooperation with investigators and his obvious psychological distress about his participation in the harassment. Emma's actions were reviewed by the district attorney's office and determined to constitute justified defense of property and reasonable response to criminal provocation. No charges were filed against her, though she was referred to Veteran Support Services for counseling and assistance with civilian readjustment challenges. The legal proceedings that followed became a landmark case for veteran rights and workplace harassment prevention. Chad's family attempted to use their wealth and connections to minimize the charges, but the overwhelming evidence and public pressure made such efforts futile. The case established important precedents about the protection of military symbols and the rights of veterans to defend their service memories. Emma returned to work at Mountain View Café after taking a brief leave to deal with the emotional aftermath of the incident. Her colleagues and regular customers welcomed her back with obvious support and respect, and the harassment that had plagued her for months completely disappeared. Chad, Kyle, and Mason were banned from the establishment and faced university disciplinary proceedings that would likely result in their expulsion. The restoration of her father's Purple Heart became a community project involving multiple veterans organizations and military historians. The medal was carefully repaired by specialists who understood its historical significance, and it was presented back to Emma in a ceremony attended by hundreds of veterans and community supporters. Sergeant Torres arranged for Emma to visit Camp Pendleton and speak with current Marines about civilian transition challenges and the importance of maintaining military values in civilian settings. Her story became part of the base's transition training program, helping other veterans understand that seeking help for harassment and adjustment difficulties was a sign of strength rather than weakness. The incident also led to policy changes at Riverside Community College regarding student conduct and harassment prevention. The university implemented new procedures for addressing off-campus harassment by students and created support services specifically designed for veteran students who might face unique challenges in academic environments. Chad Williams eventually pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence that included community service at veteran organizations, mandatory counseling about respect and empathy, and a permanent criminal record that would follow him throughout his life. His father's attempts to buy his way out of consequences had failed completely, forcing Chad to face real accountability for the first time in his privileged existence. Kyle Bennett's legal troubles extended beyond criminal charges when several of his harassment victims filed civil lawsuits for invasion of privacy and intentional infliction of emotional distress. His documented pattern of abusive behavior toward vulnerable individuals made him a liability that his family's attorneys struggled to defend. Mason Davis received probation and mandatory counseling, but his cooperation with investigators and genuine remorse for his actions earned him a chance at redemption. He transferred to a different university and became involved in veteran support organizations, dedicating himself to making amends for his participation in the harassment. Emma continued her education and eventually achieved her goal of joining law enforcement, using her military experience and the lessons learned from her harassment ordeal to become an advocate for veterans and victims of workplace abuse. Her story inspired changes in hiring practices and support services across multiple organizations. The damaged Purple Heart was displayed in a place of honor in Emma's home, its scars serving as a reminder of both her father's sacrifice and her own strength in defending his memory. The incident had tested her resolve and revealed her capacity for both violence and restraint, teaching her valuable lessons about the balance between justice and mercy. The Mountain View Café became an unofficial gathering place for veterans and their families, with Emma's story serving as an inspiration for others facing similar challenges. The incident had transformed a simple coffee shop into a symbol of community support for those who had served their country. Years later, Emma would look back on the confrontation as a turning point in her life, the moment when she learned that some battles must be fought regardless of the personal cost. Her father's medal remained her most treasured possession, its restored beauty enhanced rather than diminished by the struggle required to protect it. The story of Emma Rodriguez and her father's Purple Heart spread far beyond Riverside, becoming a rallying cry for veteran rights and a reminder that heroism takes many forms. Sometimes it means charging into battle to save lives, and sometimes it means standing up to bullies who mistake kindness for weakness. The three young men who had thought they could torment a quiet barista learned too late that they had underestimated both her capabilities and her resolve. Their assumption that military service was something to be mocked rather than respected cost them dearly, teaching them lessons about honor and consequence that their privileged upbringing had failed to provide. Emma's story became a testament to the idea that real strength comes not from the ability to inflict harm, but from the wisdom to know when such action is justified, and the courage to accept the consequences of defending what matters most. Her father's Purple Heart had been damaged but not destroyed, much like the values it represented and the daughter who had inherited them. 6 months after the incident at Mountain View Café, Emma Rodriguez stood before a graduating class of police academy recruits, her dress uniform crisp and her father's restored Purple Heart gleaming on her chest. The academy's training director had invited her to speak about courage, integrity, and the sometimes difficult transition from military to civilian service. As she looked out at the eager faces of future law enforcement officers, Emma reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that afternoon, when 3 college students had tried to destroy everything she held sacred. The courtroom proceedings had concluded 3 weeks earlier with Chad Williams receiving a sentence that surprised many observers with its severity. Judge Catherine Morrison, herself a veteran of the Gulf War, had listened to months of testimony about systematic harassment, the desecration of military honors, and the psychological impact on veterans struggling with civilian reintegration. Her final statement before sentencing had become a viral video in its own right, watched by millions who saw it as a definitive statement about respect, accountability, and the price of entitlement. Mr. Williams, Judge Morrison had said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority and personal understanding, "You stand before this court not merely as someone who damaged property, but as someone who deliberately attacked the very foundations of military service and sacrifice. Your actions represent a fundamental failure to understand that freedom isn't free, and that the medals worn by our veterans represent blood, sweat, and tears shed in defense of the values you apparently hold in contempt." Chad's sentence included 18 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service specifically with veteran organizations, and a substantial fine that would be donated to military family support charities. The judge had also ordered him to write a formal letter of apology to Emma and her family to be published in local newspapers as part of his public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Kyle Bennett's fate had been sealed by his own digital footprint. Prosecutors had discovered months of social media posts, recorded videos, and private messages that revealed a pattern of harassment targeting not just Emma, but numerous other service workers, veterans, and anyone he perceived as socially inferior. His parents' attempts to characterize his behavior as youthful indiscretion had crumbled under the weight of evidence showing calculated cruelty spanning several years. The civil lawsuits filed against Kyle had proven even more damaging than his criminal charges. 3 former classmates from high school had come forward with evidence of his harassment, including secretly recorded conversations and unauthorized photographs. 2 cafe workers from other establishments had filed complaints, showing that his abuse of Emma was part of a broader pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals for his entertainment. Kyle's conviction on multiple counts of harassment, invasion of privacy, and conspiracy had resulted in a 2-year prison sentence and a civil judgment that would likely bankrupt his family's assets. His law school applications had been withdrawn, his college enrollment had been terminated, and his future prospects had been permanently altered by his documented history of predatory behavior. Mason Davis had taken a different path entirely. His genuine remorse and cooperation with authorities had earned him a suspended sentence and probation, but, more importantly, it had sparked a personal transformation that surprised everyone who knew him. He had transferred to a different university, changed his major to social work, and dedicated himself to veteran advocacy with the intensity of someone seeking redemption. Mason's work with the Riverside Veterans Council had begun as court-ordered community service, but had evolved into a genuine passion for supporting military families. His wealthy background, rather than being a source of shame, had become an asset in his fundraising efforts for veteran mental health programs and family support services. He had personally contributed over $50,000 to organizations supporting military families, and his efforts had inspired other wealthy young people to become involved in veteran advocacy. The transformation of Mason Davis had become almost as remarkable as Emma's own journey. His panic attack during the original incident had been the catalyst for therapy that revealed years of suppressed anxiety about living up to his family's expectations and his fear of social rejection. The confrontation with Emma had forced him to confront his own moral cowardice and make fundamental changes in his character and priorities. Emma's transition from barista to police officer had been accelerated by the publicity surrounding her case. Multiple law enforcement agencies had reached out to recruit her, recognizing that her military experience, combined with her demonstrated courage and integrity, made her an ideal candidate for police work. She had chosen to join the Riverside Police Department specifically because of Detective Murphy's professionalism during the investigation and her desire to serve the community that had supported her during her darkest hours. The police academy training had been challenging but familiar territory for Emma. Her military background had prepared her for the physical demands, the weapons training, and the tactical scenarios that challenged other recruits. More importantly, her experience with the harassment and confrontation had given her insights into victim psychology and de-escalation techniques that impressed her instructors and fellow recruits. Detective Murphy had become Emma's mentor during her transition to law enforcement, sharing the wisdom gained from 15 years of police work and helping Emma navigate the complexities of civilian law enforcement. Their partnership had evolved from the professional relationship established during the investigation into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. The impact of Emma's story had extended far beyond individual consequences for those involved. Riverside Community College had implemented comprehensive anti-harassment policies, specifically designed to address the systematic abuse of service workers and veterans. The new procedures included mandatory reporting requirements for witnesses to harassment, enhanced penalties for students who engaged in abusive behavior, and specialized support services for student veterans. Mountain View Café had become an unlikely symbol of veteran support, with Lisa Thompson embracing the role of advocate for military families. The establishment had partnered with local veteran organizations to provide meeting space, job placement assistance, and informal counseling services. Emma's story had inspired a broader movement of businesses committed to supporting veterans and holding customers accountable for disrespectful behavior. The restoration of Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez's Purple Heart had become a community project that brought together veterans from multiple conflicts and service branches. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, a veteran of 3 deployments who had learned jewelry repair as a post-military career, had donated hundreds of hours to carefully removing the damage inflicted by Chad's abuse and restoring the metal to its original condition. The ceremony returning the restored Purple Heart to Emma had been attended by over 300 veterans, military families, and community supporters. The event had been covered by national media as a symbol of community resilience and the power of ordinary citizens to stand up for military values. Emma's acceptance speech had been viewed millions of times online, inspiring similar advocacy efforts across the country. Anna Chen had completed her psychology degree and was pursuing graduate studies in trauma counseling, with a specialization in veteran mental health. Her friendship with Emma had sparked an interest in the unique challenges faced by military personnel transitioning to civilian life, and she had already begun research on the effectiveness of peer support programs for veteran students. The academic research emerging from Emma's case had contributed to a growing body of literature about veteran harassment, civilian-military cultural gaps, and the importance of community support systems for military families. Universities across the country were using Emma's story as a case study in their criminal justice, psychology, and social work programs. Tom Anderson had parlayed his role as a witness in the case into a career change, leaving his security job to become a victim advocate with the district attorney's office. His military background and experience with the investigation had qualified him for specialized training in supporting veteran victims of crimes, and he had become a resource for other veterans navigating the criminal justice system. Dr. Sarah Chen had retired from her medical practice but remained active in veteran advocacy through her work with the Riverside Veterans Council. Her expert testimony during the legal proceedings had established important precedents about the psychological impact of military symbol desecration, and her research had influenced policy changes at the state and federal levels. The broader impact of Emma's story had reached the halls of Congress, where representatives from both parties had cited her case in support of legislation strengthening penalties for crimes against veterans and military families. The Purple Heart Protection Act had passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, creating federal hate crime designations for attacks on military symbols and providing enhanced funding for veteran support services. Sergeant Torres had been promoted to Master Sergeant and assigned to lead a new program at Camp Pendleton focused on civilian transition support for Marines leaving active duty. Emma's case had highlighted the need for better preparation and ongoing support for veterans entering civilian careers, and Torres had become a national advocate for comprehensive transition services. The media attention surrounding Emma's story had inspired similar cases across the country to come forward. Veterans who had suffered harassment and abuse in civilian settings began speaking out, leading to a national conversation about the treatment of military personnel and the responsibility of communities to support those who had served. Richard Williams had largely disappeared from public view following his son's conviction, his business empire suffering significant damage from the negative publicity surrounding Chad's crimes. Several of his car dealerships had faced boycotts organized by veteran groups, and his political influence had evaporated as elected officials distanced themselves from his family's scandal. The contrast between the Williams family's fall from grace and Emma's rise to prominence had become a powerful narrative about the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege. Emma's dignity throughout the ordeal had earned her admiration from across the political spectrum, while Richard Williams' attempts to buy his son's way out of consequences had been widely condemned. Emma's work as a police officer had quickly established her as a role model for community policing and veteran outreach. Her unique perspective as both a military veteran and a victim of harassment had made her particularly effective in working with vulnerable populations and de-escalating conflicts before they turned violent. The training she provided to other officers about veteran issues and trauma responses had become a model program that was being replicated in police departments across the country. Her expertise in recognizing the signs of veteran distress and her ability to communicate effectively with military personnel had prevented numerous potential confrontations and helped connect veterans with appropriate support services. Emma's personal life had also undergone significant positive changes. Her courage in standing up to harassment had inspired her to be more open about her own needs and vulnerabilities. She had begun dating a fellow police officer who was also a veteran, and their relationship was built on mutual understanding of the challenges faced by those who had served their country. The apartment she had shared with memories of loss and grief had been transformed into a home filled with mementos of her father's service and symbols of her own achievements. The restored Purple Heart occupied a place of honor in her living room, surrounded by photos of her father, her military service, and her new career in law enforcement. Emma's mother, Maria Rodriguez, had become an advocate for military families in her own right, speaking at Gold Star family events and supporting other parents who had lost children in service to their country. Her dignified response to the desecration of her husband's medal had made her a symbol of strength and resilience for military families across the nation. The scholarship fund established in Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez's name had grown to over $200,000, providing educational opportunities for children of military families and supporting veteran students pursuing careers in law enforcement and public service. Emma served on the scholarship committee, ensuring that her father's legacy continued to inspire future generations of public servants. 5 years after the incident at Mountain View Café, Emma Rodriguez was promoted to detective, becoming the youngest person in the Riverside Police Department's history to achieve that rank. Her exceptional clearance rate, her innovative approaches to victim advocacy, and her leadership in community policing had earned her recognition from law enforcement organizations across the country. The case that had once threatened to destroy her life had instead become the foundation for a career dedicated to justice and service. Emma's story continued to inspire veterans, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens who faced their own challenges with bullying, harassment, and abuse of power. Chad Williams had served his sentence and attempted to rebuild his life, but the consequences of his actions continued to follow him. His criminal record prevented him from pursuing many career opportunities, and the viral nature of his crimes ensured that his moment of cruelty would be remembered long after he had served his time. Kyle Bennett had been released from prison but remained largely unemployable due to his documented history of harassment and the civil judgments that had destroyed his family's wealth. His parents had been forced to sell their home and businesses to pay the damages awarded to his victims, and Kyle himself lived in a small apartment and worked menial jobs to pay his court-ordered restitution. Mason Davis had graduated from social work school and was employed by a veteran advocacy organization, dedicating his life to supporting military families and preventing the kind of harassment that had once made him complicit in Emma's abuse. His transformation from privileged bully to dedicated advocate had become a powerful example of the possibility for redemption and change. Emma's story had become part of the curriculum at military transition programs across all branches of service, teaching departing service members about their rights in civilian settings and the resources available to help them navigate challenges in their new lives. Her example had inspired thousands of veterans to stand up for themselves and seek help when facing harassment or discrimination. The Purple Heart that had once been ground into the pavement by a spoiled college student now served as a beacon of hope for military families facing their own challenges. Emma's courage in defending her father's memory had become a symbol of the unbreakable bond between military families and their commitment to the values of service and sacrifice. As Emma stood before the police academy graduates preparing to share her story of transformation and resilience, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain of her father's loss would never fully heal, but it had been transformed into a source of strength that enabled her to serve others and honor his memory through her own dedication to justice and service. The 3 college students who had thought they could destroy her had instead helped forge her into something stronger and more purposeful than she had ever imagined possible. Their cruelty had revealed her courage, their harassment had honed her resolve, and their contempt for military service had inspired her to become a more effective advocate for veterans and their families. Emma began her speech with a simple statement that captured the essence of her transformation and the lessons she had learned. True strength, she told the assembled recruits, is not the absence of fear or pain, but the courage to do what is right, regardless of the cost. My father's Purple Heart was damaged but not destroyed, and neither was the spirit it represents. Today I stand before you not as a victim of harassment, but as a guardian of the values that make our service meaningful. The applause that followed her words echoed through the auditorium, a testament to the power of courage, integrity, and the refusal to let bullies define the terms of engagement. Emma's story had become a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding conflict, but from standing up when it matters most and accepting the consequences of defending what we hold sacred. 10 years had passed since the confrontation that changed everything, and Detective Emma Rodriguez found herself walking through the campus of Riverside Community College on a crisp autumn morning. She wore her detective badge with pride, but today she also carried a special credential that made this visit particularly meaningful. The college had invited her to serve as the keynote speaker for their first annual Veterans Appreciation Week, an event that had grown from the policy changes implemented after her case into a comprehensive program supporting military students and their families. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that she was returning to the very institution where Chad Williams, Kyle Bennett, and Mason Davis had been students when they chose to target her for harassment. The college looked different now, with new buildings dedicated to veteran services and memorial gardens honoring local military families who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Her father's name appeared on one of the memorial plaques, placed there by the student veteran organization that had formed in the wake of her story becoming public. President Rebecca Martinez, who had taken over leadership of the college 3 years earlier, greeted Emma personally at the administration building. Dr. Martinez was herself a veteran, having served as an Army nurse during the Iraq War, and her appointment had been part of the institution's commitment to better serving military students and understanding their unique challenges. Detective Rodriguez, Dr. Martinez said warmly, "It's an honor to have you here. Your story has been instrumental in shaping how we approach veteran services and student conduct. I'm particularly excited for you to meet some of our current students who have been inspired by your example." Emma was led to a conference room where a group of student veterans had gathered for an informal discussion before the main event. These were young men and women who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other deployments, now pursuing their education with the same dedication they had shown in uniform. Their ages ranged from early 20s to late 30s, representing different branches of service and various stages of their civilian transition journey. Among the group was Corporal Jessica Martinez, a Marine veteran who had lost her leg to an IED in Afghanistan and was now studying to become a counselor specializing in veteran mental health. Sitting beside her was Staff Sergeant David Kim, an Army veteran pursuing a degree in criminal justice with hopes of following Emma's path into law enforcement. The diversity of their backgrounds and goals reflected the changing face of higher education, as more veterans chose to continue their service through civilian careers. "Ma'am," Corporal Martinez said as Emma entered the room, "I wanted to thank you personally. When I first came to this campus, I was struggling with PTSD and feeling like I didn't belong in civilian academia. Your story showed me that veterans don't have to hide who we are or apologize for our service. It gave me the courage to ask for help when I needed it and to be proud of my military identity." Staff Sergeant Kim nodded in agreement. "I read about your case during my transition from active duty. What impressed me most wasn't just that you stood up to those bullies, but how you turned that experience into a career dedicated to helping others. You proved that our military training doesn't make us dangerous civilians, but rather gives us unique skills to serve our communities in new ways." Emma spent nearly an hour with the student veterans, answering questions about her transition from military to civilian life, her decision to enter law enforcement, and the ongoing challenges of balancing military identity with civilian expectations. She was struck by how articulate and motivated these students were, and how different their experience seemed from her own difficult adjustment period a decade earlier. The transformation was evident throughout the campus. The Veteran Services Office occupied a prominent location in the Student Center, staffed by trained counselors who understood military culture and transition challenges. The college had partnerships with local businesses to provide internships and job placement assistance specifically for veteran students. Most importantly, there was a culture of respect and support that hadn't existed during Emma's original time as a student. Dr. Martinez escorted Emma to the auditorium where over 800 students, faculty, staff, and community members had gathered for her keynote address. The audience included many faces Emma recognized from her years of police work in the community, as well as veterans from across Southern California who had traveled to hear her speak. In the front row sat Maria Rodriguez, Emma's mother, whose pride was evident in every line of her face. As Emma approached the podium, she noticed a familiar figure in the audience that made her pause. Mason Davis sat in the middle section, now 30 years old, and bearing little resemblance to the frightened college freshman who had cowered while his friends tormented her. He wore a simple suit and carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had found his purpose in life. His presence at the event spoke to the genuine transformation he had undergone in the years since the incident. Emma began her speech by acknowledging the progress the college had made in supporting veteran students, but she quickly shifted to the broader themes that had defined her journey from harassment victim to community leader. She spoke about the difference between courage and fearlessness, explaining that true bravery required acting despite fear rather than in its absence. "When those 3 students chose to target me for harassment," Emma said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "they saw someone they perceived as weak and vulnerable. What they didn't understand was that military service teaches you that strength comes not from the ability to inflict harm, but from the discipline to endure hardship and the wisdom to know when action is necessary." She talked about her father's service and the meaning of the Purple Heart that had been at the center of the confrontation. The medal, she explained, represented more than individual sacrifice. It symbolized the commitment of military families to values larger than themselves and the responsibility of communities to honor that commitment through respect and support. "My father never expected recognition for his service," Emma continued. "He enlisted because he believed in something greater than his own comfort and safety. When those students chose to desecrate his medal, they weren't just attacking a piece of metal and ribbon. They were attacking the very foundation of military service and the families who sacrifice so that others can live in freedom." Emma's description of the incident itself was brief but powerful. She focused not on the physical confrontation, but on the emotional journey that had led to that moment and the lessons she had learned from it. Her military training, she explained, had prepared her to defend herself and others, but it had also taught her the importance of proportional response and accountability for one's actions. "Violence should never be the first option," she said, "but sometimes it becomes necessary to protect what matters most. The key is ensuring that when we do act, we do so with precision, purpose, and acceptance of the consequences. I have never regretted defending my father's memory, but I also understood from the moment I made that choice that I would be held accountable for my actions." The audience was completely silent as Emma described the investigation that followed and the legal proceedings that had determined the fate of everyone involved. She spoke with respect for the justice system that had carefully weighed the evidence and the circumstances before reaching its conclusions. Her account was factual and measured, showing the same professional demeanor that had made her successful as a police officer. Emma's discussion of the aftermath focused on the positive changes that had emerged from the confrontation. She highlighted the policy reforms at educational institutions across the country, the increased awareness of veteran harassment issues, and the community partnerships that had developed to support military families. Her story had become a catalyst for broader social change that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The detective then shifted to her current work and the ways her military experience continued to serve her community. She described cases where her understanding of military culture had helped her connect with veteran suspects, victims, and witnesses. Her ability to recognize the signs of PTSD, survivor guilt, and adjustment disorders had made her more effective at de-escalating potentially violent situations and connecting people with appropriate resources. "Law enforcement and military service share many core values," Emma explained. "Both require courage, integrity, and a commitment to serving others even at personal risk. My military training didn't make me a better police officer because it taught me how to fight. It made me better because it taught me discipline, attention to detail, and the importance of mission accomplishment through teamwork and dedication." Emma also addressed the ongoing challenges faced by veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Despite significant improvements in support services and public awareness, many veterans continued to struggle with finding their place in civilian society. The skills that made them exceptional military personnel didn't always translate obviously to civilian occupations, and the cultural differences between military and civilian environments could create ongoing friction. "The solution," Emma said, "isn't to expect veterans to abandon their military identity or to pretend that our service experience doesn't matter. The solution is to build bridges between military and civilian communities, to create opportunities for mutual understanding and respect, and to recognize that diversity of experience makes our community stronger." She spoke directly to the veteran students in the audience, encouraging them to take pride in their service while remaining open to the learning opportunities that civilian education provided. Their military experience was an asset, she emphasized, but it was one that needed to be combined with civilian skills and perspectives to maximize their potential for continued service. Emma's speech concluded with a reflection on forgiveness and redemption that surprised many in the audience. She acknowledged that 2 of her former tormentors had never shown genuine remorse for their actions and continued to face the consequences of their choices. However, she also spoke positively about Mason Davis's transformation and his dedicated work with veteran advocacy organizations. "Redemption is possible," Emma said, "but it requires genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing, sustained effort to make amends, and a commitment to becoming a better person. It's not enough to simply serve a sentence or pay a fine. True redemption means dedicating your life to repairing the damage you've caused and ensuring that others don't suffer as your victims did." The standing ovation that followed Emma's speech lasted for several minutes, with many audience members visibly moved by her message of resilience, service, and hope. As the applause died down, Dr. Martinez returned to the podium to announce a surprise that had been kept secret even from Emma herself. "Detective Rodriguez," Dr. Martinez said, "your story has inspired not just policy changes and individual transformations, but also a lasting commitment to honoring military service and sacrifice. Today, on behalf of the Riverside Community College Board of Trustees, I'm pleased to announce the establishment of the Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez Veterans Excellence Scholarship, funded by donations from community members who were inspired by your courage and your father's sacrifice." The scholarship announcement brought Emma to tears for the first time during the event. The fund would provide full tuition support for veteran students pursuing degrees in public service fields, ensuring that her father's legacy would continue to inspire future generations of military personnel transitioning to civilian careers in law enforcement, education, social work, and other service-oriented professions. After the formal ceremony concluded, Emma was approached by Mason Davis, who had waited patiently for the crowd to thin before seeking the opportunity to speak with her privately. The young man who stood before her bore no resemblance to the frightened teenager who had participated in her harassment. His eyes showed the depth of someone who had confronted his own failures and emerged with genuine wisdom and humility. "Detective Rodriguez," Mason said quietly, "I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I wanted you to know that not a day passes that I don't think about what we did to you and how wrong it was. I've spent the last 10 years trying to make amends through my work with veteran organizations, but I know that can never fully repair the harm we caused." Emma studied his face carefully, using the skills she'd developed as both a Marine and a police officer to assess his sincerity. What she saw was genuine remorse combined with a maturity that spoke to real personal growth. Mason's transformation appeared to be authentic rather than performative, and his continued work with veteran advocacy groups suggested a sustained commitment to making amends. "Mason," Emma replied, using his first name deliberately to signal that she saw him as a person rather than just a symbol of past trauma. "I've watched your work with the Veterans Council over the years. Your dedication to supporting military families has made a real difference in our community. That's not something you do to avoid consequences or improve your public image. That's something you do because you understand what service really means." Their conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, covering Mason's work with veteran organizations, his career in social work, and his ongoing efforts to prevent the kind of harassment and bullying that had once made him complicit in Emma's abuse. He had become a powerful advocate for bystander intervention, speaking at schools and colleges about the importance of standing up when witnessing abuse, rather than remaining silent. Mason's transformation had become almost as remarkable as Emma's own journey. His wealthy background, which had once been a source of entitlement and insulation from consequences, had become a tool for supporting veteran families and funding programs that might not otherwise exist. He had donated over $500,000 to veteran causes over the past decade, and his fundraising efforts had generated millions more in support for military families. Emma left the college that day with a profound sense of closure and hope. The institution that had once been the backdrop for her harassment had become a model for supporting veteran students and honoring military service. The community that had watched her struggle with civilian transition had embraced her as a leader and role model. Most importantly, the story that had begun with cruelty and destruction had evolved into a narrative of resilience, justice, and redemption. The drive home took Emma past Mountain View Café, which had closed 2 years earlier when Lisa Thompson retired and moved to be closer to her grandchildren. The building now housed a veteran services organization that provided job training, counseling, and community support for military families. A small plaque by the entrance honored the location as the site where Detective Emma Rodriguez took her stand for military honor and veteran dignity. Emma's father's Purple Heart remained in its place of honor in her home, its restored beauty serving as a daily reminder of both loss and resilience. The medal had survived deliberate destruction and emerged stronger, much like the values it represented and the daughter who had inherited the responsibility to defend them. As she reflected on the decade that had passed since the confrontation, Emma realized that her story had become larger than her individual experience. It had become a symbol of the ongoing tension between military and civilian cultures, the importance of community support for veterans, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept injustice. The three college students who had thought they could destroy her spirit had instead helped forge it into something unbreakable. Their cruelty had revealed her courage, their harassment had strengthened her resolve, and their contempt for military service had inspired her to become a more effective advocate for veterans and their families. Emma Rodriguez had started that journey as a struggling veteran trying to find her place in civilian society. She had become a detective, a community leader, and a symbol of hope for military families across the nation. Her father's Purple Heart had been damaged but not destroyed, and neither had the spirit of service that it represented. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.